All right, well, it looks like everybody's here. My name is Jeff Javier, and I'm with the Sonoran Center for Excellence in Disabilities from the University of Arizona. And I'm one of the co-hosts for today's session. I'm just gonna go over some community guidelines before we get started. Number one, please assume good faith from your colleagues. We are all here to learn together. Two, please use the chat or raise hand function if you wish to share. Participants are not permitted to unmute themselves. To share verbally, you will be called on after virtually raising your hand. For those of you joining via phone, you can raise your hand by hitting *9 on your keypad, and then unmute by hitting *6. Number three, please recognize and respect others' feelings, background, and cultural differences. Four, we won't be able to get to all questions answered during this meeting. Five, please be judicious and efficient with shared information and experiences. If you are speaking, try to limit yourself to 30 seconds or less. It can be just as courageous to listen as it is to share. So please do your best to understand when it is best to step back instead of stepping up. Six, if you are speaking, please speak slowly, as we have an English captioner working diligently in the background and 2 ASL interpreters. This is true for our presenters as well as our participants. And I will now hand it off to Natalie Luna Rose.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our first day of the African American Conference on Disabilities, our 11th annual, second virtual, and you are attending session number 2. We do have other sessions, sessions 3 and 4 on Thursday, and I'll get to that later as we are ending today's session. So again, I'm Natalie Luna Rose. I'm the Outreach and Communications Manager for the Arizona Center for Disability Law. And I would like to thank our sponsors for helping us put on this terrific conference. Without their help, we could not get this going and make this possible to share this information to the community. So without further ado, I'd like to thank our gold sponsor, Perkins Coie, our silver sponsors, Arizona Department of Health Services and Valley Toyota, our bronze sponsors, Ability 360, and our advocates, Unique Multiple Connections, Arizona State University, Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council, Arizona Commission for Deaf and Hard of Hearing, Arizona Community Foundation, Banner University Health Plans, Diverse Ability Incorporated, Lexus Superstition Springs, National Disability Rights Network, Marks the Spot, NAACP Maricopa County Branch, Raising Special Kids, and our co-hosts, Sonoran Youssef from the University of Arizona, Institute for Human Development at Northern Arizona University, and Arizona Center for African American Resources, ASCAR, and of course my colleagues here at the Arizona Center for Disability Law. So again, thank you for joining us. And today's session, second session, Born to Advocate, Portraits of Black Mothers of Children on the Autism Spectrum, will be presented today by Dr. Elizabeth Holliday Morgan, Assistant Professor in the Doctorate of Educational Leadership Program at the California State University, Sacramento, and Ms. Benita Shaw, Community Education Specialist, University of California, Davis, Mind Institute in the Resource Center. So I will allow them to give their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for that introduction. I'm going to attempt to share our screen, and we'll go off video at that point. All right. So as Natalie said, we are going to be talking today and really uplifting the voices of Black mothers of children on the autism spectrum. With that, just to let you know, like they said, we will not have time to answer all questions, but we will do our very best to answer as many questions as possible. So please type them in the chat. And at the end, we will try to make sure to have time to answer questions, any that we don't get to, and any that come up at that point. But then we do leave our contact information for follow-up if you have like to connect after. So it's really important. I am a researcher, and as specifically as a qualitative critical researcher, I really acknowledge how important it is that I acknowledge the positionality that I bring into all of my work. And on the left side of this screen, you see a picture of two people, one woman with long dark hair and graduation regalia, and next to her is a young teen boy or preteen boy, and that picture is of myself and my son. My first and most important position in life is a mother. I have two beautiful children, and this young man in this picture is my youngest, my son, who was diagnosed to be autistic when he was 2.5 years old. And I have the privilege and the honor of being able to really experience him and just see him grow and become the amazing young man that he has today. But it really has influenced all of my work, not just the fact that I am a researcher, but I'm a researcher specifically that investigates and tries to tell the story of the navigation process for marginalized populations. And specifically, the two studies I'll talk to you about today are two studies that were specifically focusing on Black women who had children on the autism spectrum. So this is important to be able to bring to the table because I've experienced, what it's like, not only because I am an educator at training. I was a teacher and an administrator, so I'd been on the side of many special education meetings as an administrator in charge for those meetings, but also as a parent. So I understand the experience of why this type of work is so important. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Benita.
Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to be here all with you. Thank you, Dr. Morgan. And it's an honor to be here with you, my sister, on today. My name is Benita Shaw. I'm going to describe to you a little on this picture and share you a little about me. In this picture, you see actually three people, a woman in a dress, another woman that's has some bright pink shoes, standing up to a tall gentleman. And if you notice in that picture, there's something that's hanging around her neck, which is a communication device. The picture I just described to you is my amazing son, one of my amazing sons. His name is Christopher. He was diagnosed with autism at 2.5. In this particular picture is one of the things that I portrayed as being an advocate, where I'm in an interview with a local news station. Advocating at that time, where one of the many things that I've done was to speak to police officers in regards to engaging with people with disabilities, preferably young Black men who happen to somehow be a threat because of their size and their skin tone. So then we were there speaking in regards to that manner. And the reason why I brought attention to what's around my neck is because my son, society labels him as nonverbal. I like to use the word body language first, because we truly speak through our body before we even utter anything coming out of our mouth. I do have an older son who's off in college. I do have a degree in psychology. I have the great opportunity to recently be at the Mind Institute, working in the Resource Center and being around a multitude of people to hopefully to make change in different aspects of the disability community. I serve on a multitude of different boards, advocating for what I believe our loved ones need, and truly making sure that they hear our voice in the room. And I think that's something that is very important, is that our voice is heard in every aspect of the room, of disability into services, and what have you. So with that being said, I will turn that back over to Dr. Morgan.
Just 1 second before we proceed. Crystal, is there any chance you could back up or maybe have your hands show up more in your video? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So now I'm just going to give an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So, our agenda will include all of these topics, but first, I just really want to lay the foundation for some key terms and terminology that we're going to use today. So you're going to hear us using terms that we want to make sure that we are acknowledging and honoring our National Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Specifically their preference to use identity first language, but we also are acknowledging the language that is in the federal legislation of person first language. So you're going to see and hear these two terms used interchangeably. So such as autistic person, person on the autism spectrum, but likewise autism parent, ASD parent, parent of a child on the autism spectrum in a very similar manner. We'll also go into depth, specifically giving you some background to the work that we have, the current research that is on autism in Black community. And we'll then transition and talk about some of the newer research that's happening, some of the more asset-based research that's happening in the Black community, specifically when it comes to disabilities and autism. And I'll describe those projects, and we'll describe those projects in detail. Then we will talk about research into practice and how research can be made and should really in a lot of ways be used to be able to affect change. So how are we at the Mind Institute in Sacramento taking the information and making it into programs and projects that can be able to really support families? And so we'll talk about a specific project called the Sankofa Parent Support Group, Family Support Group, and we'll give you some testimonies from some of the Sankofa families. Last two things we'll do is talk about implications, next steps, and then go over our question and answers. So now we'll give a little overview of some of the background. So Benita.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. This is just a little overview before we get started to share with you a little of the background of Black children. Currently, literature on the disparities involving ASD in the Black community give evidence much work needs to be done. Black children on the autism spectrum are diagnosed 1.5 times plus later than their counter white parts in this country. We also find that Black children are up to 3 times more likely to initially be misdiagnosed with emotional disturbance, cognitive impairment, and or ADHD. And we also know that Black families, despite educational status, socioeconomic status, and still having limited access to services after they finally receive the diagnosis of their children. We will go into this a little bit more in our presentation, where you see, as Dr. Morgan talks a little bit more about in her studies about when we speak about the socioeconomic status, the educational statuses of these parents going forward. Dr. Morgan.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, and specifically, we're going to now move forward. These particular studies give us a lot of great information, but they really tend to focus on the deficits of what's within the communities, right? And so what's happening within the Black community, and really it's deficit based. And they're necessary in that we need to know and we need to be able to see what are the disparities. But I was far more interested in looking at the assets of the community and what are the resources that the community has and are utilizing to be able to support their children and their families. So segueing, we're going to talk specifically about two projects. One is available and has been published through the British Journal of Sociology of Education this year. And this is a project that specifically focused on hearing the voices and telling the stories of single Black mothers using their cultural capital to access autism intervention in schools. And so we're going to talk in depth about this particular study and about some of the findings next. So I think it's really important because, as you know, I'm a teacher at heart, and it's important that I explain things and make sure that key concepts are understood. I want to highlight a few of the key concepts that are a part of this and other studies that are really important to be able to understand. I also, because of I believe in universal design for learning, that I want to give representations, multiple representations, so that you can be able to have a better grasp of what are some of these concepts are. So for instance, if we're thinking about the concept of cultural capital. In very traditional senses, in academics, we think about cultural capital as the way it is described by sociologists, and how it really is associated with a person's social assets that they or their group hold, such as their education or their pedigree, their lineage, their background. And in this classic definition, it really gives us more of an idea of this of how the transmission of this status and power is given from generation to generation. So if we're wanting to just conceptualize this in a visual, I'm giving a visual of two piggy banks. One piggy bank is completely complete. It has coins in it. It's full. It's bright. It's complete. You know, it's unbreakable, right? That's if we're thinking about cultural capital in that respect, we can conceptualize. If you have cultural capital, you look like the top piggy bank, which is not broken. The bottom piggy bank is a broken piggy bank, right? And so they do not have the resources, the pedigree, the background, right? So this idea of just you have it or you do not have it is a concept that when we think of cultural capital, traditionally, that's the way we think of it. I want to be able to present to you another way of thinking about this. And specifically, there is this concept of community cultural wealth. And this comes from the work of many theorists, but specifically, I'm going to highlight the work of Dr. Terioso, who is a researcher, and specifically in critical race theory and CRT. And she talks about how can we use and think about community cultural wealth as capital that communities of color possess and that are transmitted and are translatable to within their community as cultural capital. So this is a critical approach that allows us to look at forms of capital that are often unacknowledged, unrecognized, and really are not seen as the internal assets that they are, because they are in fact vehicles for social mobility. So an example of community cultural wealth would be something like this piggy bank, which is a piggy bank with armor around it, right? So not only is this piggy intact, but it also is fortified, and it has the tools to not only stay intact, but to be able to navigate systems that are entrenched in systemic and institutional social oppressions. So going deeper into community cultural wealth as a model, I'm going to describe to you the different forms of cultural capital that are part of this community cultural wealth. So these are all done by theorists, and I'm highlighting the work once again of Dr. Terioso, who's the picture I have up with the diagram. And I'm going to explain briefly what these capitals are. So aspirational capital, just in summary, is the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for a future, even in the face of real and perceived barriers. Familial capital is the capital knowledge from family or kin that carry a sense of community, memory, and cultural intuition. Social capital is one that many of us are very familiar with. So it's this idea of networks. It's the idea of networks of people and community resources that people have. Linguistic capital is the intellectual and social skills attained through communication experiences in more than one language and or style. So African American vernacular would be another example of another language style that a person with linguistic capital can use. Resistance capital refers to those skills and knowledge fostered through oppositional behavior that challenges inequality. So this idea of not taking no for an answer, right? Not allowing someone else's views and ideas of you keep you from being able to make progress. This is this idea of resisting. Navigational capital refers to the skills of maneuvering through social institutions, especially ones not designed with communities of color in mind. So we all know when we're talking about schools in particular, schools were not built with Black people in mind as far as being included and having full access. And we still see the residual effects of this today. And many of the red flags that we see today are a residual effect of the fact that schools were really not built in order to be able to have full inclusion for people of color and Black people in mind. So now that we are, because I told you I really was interested in being able to uplift the voices of Black mothers, I knew that I wanted to include some other work and other research into the studies to really get a holistic idea of what exactly are the resources that the mothers are using. So I pulled upon two other people's work, Dr. Ming-Cheng Lo from her work specifically on motherhood capital, which was a theme that emerged during her interviews of 25 low-income monolingual Mexican-American mothers as they use their influence in schools and medical settings to be mother advocates for their children. And I think, Benita, you have an example of that from our text.
Yes, so I think this is very important to read these examples off of Dr. Morgan's study. And so I'm going to read the example of motherhood capital that she has listed in her study. And it reads, but I just kept doing it. And I just kind of kept on doing it. I think that gave me more knowledge as you speak to parents. There weren't many Black parents, but just parents in general. Were you listening to them tell their story?
Thank you so much, Benita. And another capital and another body of work that I pulled into this particular work was from Dr. Prudence Carter work on Black cultural capital. So this is the knowledge and the possessions of cultural capital and non-dominant cultural capital that exists in various social spheres or social arenas. And it's the ability to specifically fluidly utilize these capitals in the appropriate context. So we might think of this as these ideas, this concept of code switching, right? This idea to easily be able to go in and out of different cultural contexts that if you're an African American in this country, you have to be able to do. It is a life skill to be able to do, to be able to function, right? So this idea of code switching, and the higher you're able to be able to pull upon this Black cultural capital, the more likely in this study you're able to have some greater outcomes. And so Benita, I think she also has an example of that from the study.
Yes, and I will tell you that this study has hit home, and I think myself and Dr. Morgan can truly relate to this statement. It says, you can laugh in my face all the time, but I already know if you are not with me, you know, you are really against me, and that I need to be careful with. And I think that was just an important reason why I wanted to bring this out, is because we as Black mothers feel that way all the time. As Dr. Morgan stated, we code switch. And this statement from this mother from her study resonates with me on a daily. And I think it was important to share her words.
Thank you. And I think definitely just this idea of having full knowledge of the different the different standards that are being held, and how, as a result of her intersectional experience of being a Black woman, this mother demonstrated that she acknowledges, she understands and sees the double standard, and she wants to make sure that they know that she sees the double standard. So I'm going to briefly go over the demographics. So for this particular study, this project, I was able to read saturation, which means that I was able to see the themes that were repetitive and they were consistent by the fifth full interview. And this is just an example. So if you can see, the mother's average age was about 47 years of 47 years old. Children are about 10 years old. The mothers were highly educated in that all of them had at least some type of college education, which is not abnormal, because we know that from the National Center for Educational Statistics that Black women are the single most educated group in the US. Also to note, if we look at the socioeconomic status, we see that there's a range there, right? And most of our mothers making about 53K, which in California is still really not doing as well as, you know, a lot of us need to be doing. And so we see there highly educated disparities in income, specifically being single mothers and then being single Black mothers. But I also really want to note this last panel right here, which is school placement. And so, as for those who are familiar with the Individuals Education Act, with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, the legislation promotes that all children with disabilities be placed in the least restricted environment, right? And so in this situation, all of the mothers were not given an opportunity or even an option to have their children to be fully included in many cases. And the only exception would be May, and her son was included into a general ed / special education split after years of advocacy, and not until he was in junior high, right? So that was not the first option or even given as an option for many of the families. So, as you know, and as I stated, this is a qualitative study. So these numbers and this graph is only to represent the frequency or the number of times that coders, and these were multiple coders, found instances of these capitals being demonstrated in the interviews. So as you can see from the graph, that all the mothers had exhibited many forms of capital and in many instances, but there are dominant themes, meaning that there were two capitals in particular that really stood out that mothers were utilizing in their advocacy. And those were resistant capital, which was not taking over an answer, and then navigational capital, which is being able to maneuver and navigate spaces that were built with you not in mind. So now I'm going to get, Benita's going to read some examples from the interviews of resistance and navigational capital.
Thank you. So in resistance to navigational capital, this is what Evelyn stated. She says, am I well to tell you this? That's what came to me the years standing up to the people in the room that don't look like me. It required you to use knowledge you have. It required you to understand you have it. It required you to realize that you got this. You know what is best for your child. And I think that to me, this resonated with me from Evelyn, because it truly, you have to stand, you have to know what is important to the child. And as she highlighted in here, you got to stand up. You truly have to know the knowledge, because knowledge is power, right? You have to understand who's in the room, who's around you, what's being said, and you have to realize, you truly have to realize, you know, where you're at kind of in that room, right? And to realize that, you know, I got this, because we are that most important person in that room.
Thank you so much, Benita. Absolutely. The next capital that will be highlighted is navigational capital.
Navigational capital. I think it was harder because I hadn't seen a lot of single Black women out there. It required me to remove myself out of that grief state and realize I have to find out, I have to figure out what it is that's going to benefit my son. And truly, again, I have to say that I also resonated with this particular, with Josephine, because we had to find out what it was on our own. We had to figure that out. And I know for me in starting that, and I know Dr. Morgan is the same, is that we were always looking for that other person, that other woman in the room that we feel we could relate to, along with a multitude of other things that our children are going through, not just in that educational system, but it also affected their education.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. So this third theme that we're going to talk about is a theme that emerged during multiple phases of analysis of the data. And during the third analysis of this data, we noticed that there tended to be this trend that we coined generational resistance. And so this is the idea, and it was coded and defined when the collaborators or participants connected their perseverance for advocacy for their children to historical accounts of resistance from their ancestors or people within their community. So it's the notion of them finding the strength to press forward from the roots of the struggle from their ancestors. So examples of this generational resistance included another account from Evelyn. And so I'll have Benita just say that one.
Okay. I was blessed to be raised by a strong Black single woman. And she made sure no matter what, when she walked into a room, you knew it was her walking into a room. You knew it was her. You knew that she would demand to be treated in that right fashion. I added my little twist to it because it truly touched me at home as a resemblance of my mother growing up in certain ways. And so she was resemblant of what Evelyn spoke about her mother, because she made sure that you knew who she was when she walked into a room, no matter what. She was an educated, strong, single Black woman, and that was important. So I can truly relate to Evelyn because I had one of those too.
Yes, and I did too, right? And so this idea that, that mothers were basically pulling upon their ability to advocate because they were seeing others that were engaging in that type of advocacy and in different forms, right? So it wasn't the special education system or the medical system or intervention system. It was, them being able to stand up against, Jim Crow laws in the South, or being discriminated from being able to have entrance into school or places and environments. So all of those are examples of this generational resistance. So bottom line, mothers when they were respected and empowered, they had good relationships with schools and schools professionals, right? So when schools demonstrated that they were really allowing mothers to be equal partners, which is a part of the legislation, right, in the IEP process, the mothers were able to exercise their advocacy, and they were feeling like equal partners, and they were able to see greater outcomes for their children. We also found that mothers were able to push forward because of the struggles from their ancestors. So, the experiences of the past were actually fuel for the future, right? And really help support these advocacy skills or this generational resistance. So we're gonna stop just for a second. We're not and allow you to process, but then also engage in any type of questions that you have. Please put them in the chat. I have been monitoring the chat a little bit. Mostly I've seen comments, but if you have any questions, please type them in and we will make sure to try to get to them. But also we will probably move forward and make sure that we have enough time to have a good amount of time for question and answers at the end. So please, if you have any questions, type them in at this time. All right, thank you. Okay, so the next project that I'm going to talk to you about is a current project that I'm working on for publication. I'm hoping to make this a part of a bigger publication, possibly a book. And so this one is specifically focusing on the developmental process of parent advocacy for Black mothers of children on the autism spectrum. So I knew from the previous study, right, that there were these amazing advocacy skills that were happening, that, you know, the mothers were pulling upon past experiences, but we didn't know quite we needed to know more about this process of development. And so that's what this particular study was doing. In the study, we involved 7 Black mothers who were peer coaches for other families that had children on the autism spectrum across the country. This is specifically, I interviewed mothers from 3 different states, so California, New York, and Pennsylvania. And in them, I asked questions about their advocacy, but then also how did they use their advocacy for their children, but then also for the people that they coached and supported. So again, brief demographics. So these are the mothers. The average age is about 54 years old. Average kid age is about 16 years old. And most of them were diagnosed a little over 3 years old. So this is going right to the heart of the findings for this particular study. So what I was able to find after looking and applying some developmental theories to really conceptualize what it might be happening here is that there are phases of advocacy development. So you will see that there are 3 different phases. And so there's the trustworthy agents of support, is the first phase. Second phase is advocacy value system development. And third phase is positive adaptation. And so these all take place over time. And let me describe a little bit of what happens within each one. So trustworthy agents of support really comes from this idea that there were key people in the mother's lives that were either family members or community members that had stake in their lives. They were trusted and they were trustworthy. These were people that the mothers could look to either before the diagnosis or at the time of diagnosis for their child, that really gave them a lot of information and helped spark their advocacy, right? Many of these people were very knowledgeable. They had, maybe they were people that were already involved in the educational system or medical system. One of the things that was very, very common is that the mother's mother was the trustworthy agent of support. So the maternal grandmother of the child was a key person involved in this phase of trustworthy agents of support. The second phase, which I'm calling the advocacy value system development, is in the diagram is in a black box. And the reason why it's in a black box is because we all know that advocacy is so important for children, right? We know through the literature, we know through our experiences that every child needs an advocate, needs someone to be in their corner. But we don't know so much, and especially when it comes to Black families, what is a part of that advocacy? What's inside of the box that really makes it work? So what I was able to see, and our team was able to see, is that there was this process and there was this experience, a dynamic experience of a stressor happening in the mother's life and a barrage of resources that flooded to be able to support that mother in being able to get what she needed for her child. So whether she engaged in resistance, right? She resisted what was being said about her child, or she connected to social connections and people within her community, or she learned how, or she pulled in some of her navigational skills and problem solving skills. All of these things would happen. And I put these arrows in here to show that there's a relationship, but this middle arrow really is to be able to demonstrate that there are multiple pathways to being able to get to this, to the outcome that she desires, right? So if a stressor hit, And let's just be honest, a variety of stressors hit at one time simultaneously. Maybe it's a contentious IEP, a medical diagnosis, some type of behavior, new behavior coming that the mother had never seen for her child, or maybe there was a look, at a grocery store. There's all these different stressors, right, that are coming from outside, coming into the family's life, that the mother had to respond. And as she became more seasoned in her advocacy, she was able to respond more quickly and be able to pull in the resources that she needed to be able to support her child. This next phase of advocacy development for these mothers, we're calling the positive adaptation. And so what we saw here is that there was this experience of the mothers not only going to this phase of acceptance of themselves, acceptance of their child, their disabled child, acceptance of their child being an autistic person, but then also this idea that their advocacy identity was something that they were proud of, right? That they were very proud of, and they saw it as a strength. And then this last piece connects right to some of the theory that we have from Erik Erikson's work on stages of psychosocial development that happens about mid-adulthood, which we all know that these mothers were in that phase where people either come into a phase of having generativity or stagnation. And so during this stage, adults will strive to create and nurture things that will outlast them, that will often have contributions and bring positive changes to benefit other people. And we saw that all of these mothers were, yes, hitting that generativity because they were, in fact, elected to become parent coaches for other families of children who had a recent diagnosis of their child being on the autism spectrum. So this last arrow, this green arrow on the bottom here, how it swoops from stage 3 to stage 1, is not to represent that the mothers have this go through this process all over again. It really is to demonstrate how the mothers become a phase 1 trustworthy agent of support for another mother or another family as they are peer coaches and advocates within their community. And this meshes and really complements very nicely with the work of Dr. Patricia Hill Collins, Black feminist work on mother work or other mothering that really reiterates that for centuries, this is nothing new. Black women have been doing this. It has been about, it has always been about not just my child, but the welfare and the care of children within my community and people within my community, in my surroundings. And so these mothers were demonstrating that again, how they knew that they would have to take the skills that they have, these advocacy abilities, and now transfer and transmit that to another generation of parents to become strong advocates for their children. So now we're going to give an example of trustworthy agents of support. And before we do that, I should let you know, a part of this study, I had all of my collaborators come and bring artifacts. And so the artifacts I asked them to bring were to represent what they thought represented their advocacy for themselves and their children, and then also advocacy for their people that they were coaching, the people that they were peer coaching. And so this particular artifact came from Ola, and she brought a beautiful porcelain figurine of a Black nurse. And this figurine was really to represent what she felt was the essence of her mother. And so Ola is going to represent, Ola's quote will now be read by Bonita.
Thank you. So the quote states, "This statue represents my advocacy for Carmelo because it was the closest thing it was the closest thing that I have that I think represents the essence of my mother. My mother demonstrated perseverance through the years. She was a poor girl growing up in New York City and put herself through nursing school through the Great Depression. In fact, she was rejected from her choice of nursing school because she was Black. She showed me how to overcome because she had overcome so many different things with adversity in her job, getting her job, her education, which showed me how to become an advocate for myself. She was that one that showed me the ropes. Sorry, I just had a thing pop up on my screen. I'm sorry, guys. It blocked my reading. So that was my rock. My mother was a single mom, a single Black mom taking care of her children just like that. You know, and as Dr. Morgan just stated what she just went through, that connection of that trustworthy agency, here it is. Here was the example of that trustworthy agency of support from that mother to her daughter. And it gave that prime example of what I think a lot of us can say we had this, whether it was a grandparent, an auntie, an uncle, but that trustworthy agent that gave us that support, as we stated with, I think it was Evelyn in the previous one, that allowed us to stand, to gain that knowledge and to gain that advocacy, because that advocacy started back way back when, before we were here.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And so now we're going to go into the next phase and give you some examples of the phase of development. And so the advocacy value system development is phase 2. And so this particular item that was given for that the mother gave to be able to demonstrate her advocacy was a pair of clippers. And so she's holding a pair of clippers in her hand to be able to demonstrate why what she felt was an example of her advocacy for her children. It's something she learned as a result. So Benita, you want to summarize this one?
Sure. What we could do, if you could focus on the writing in the red, because this is the important part of us, this mother, when Dr. Morgan spoke earlier, when she talked about, she developed her own advocacy system for her boys. I could relate to this too, because of the fact there was challenges of getting them to go to the barbershop. You know, and you go out and your child have challenges and people don't understand what happens, you're judged. There's a lot of questions and there's a lot of stares. So with that, this mother had to develop and own her own system that would work for her. Right. So in developing that own system, she decided to do and started cutting at home. So for one of the things she stated and things that were really powerful is it says, you know, I made it. She said, for me, I realized that I could learn because they learned to sit still. They knew what was coming. So she taught them about how to, can you imagine? So it's almost like it was a gift that she had this thing occur out in the public, because she took that challenge that was kind of put at her and brought it home and says, you know what, we're going to do this. We can do this. And here we are here growing together. And that's what she says, together we can learn and grow and tolerate what comes to us, right? We can go through this and we can learn and grow, and together we can do it. And I think that is just resonates with all of us, is that we had to regroup, you know, and what did that build up? You built that system at home, and now here it is. You go out in the community, and you know, again, back to some of the other statements, you could stand, right? You could stand, you can be present in the room because you know what it takes to develop that own strategic plan, advocacy, or whatever that situation might be for your child, that we did it. And this mother did it. And I think that was just so powerful for her.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think the whole notion of perseverance, right? So this idea that there was this obstacle, right? When she went out into the public, she would receive stares from people because of the actions and behaviors of her twin boys. And as a mother, she didn't like it, but she also knew that her sons needed a haircut. So she put it, like Benita said, pulled her own skills together because she wasn't a barber, but came up with the skills to be able to do it. And it became a special time for them where they would sit down and talk, and she learned more about them, and she learned more about herself, and she learned more about what they could do together and about the amazing things they can do when they get to the point where they support one another and they are accepting and loving and provide that type of atmosphere for themselves. And so it really is a powerful example of this value system development that occurred. The next quote we're going to give and just summarize this idea of positive adaptation, right? And in this particular artifact that was given, the mother in this, who was Tress, she decided that she wanted to give an example of a puzzle piece, right? So she's holding up a puzzle piece. And this is why she thought it was important to be able to give this puzzle piece. So Benita, you want to say that?
Absolutely. So in this, where she talks about the puzzle piece, she says, I was the link. And I read this and I thought, man, she just put it just kind of mildly, because she was the whole link. She was the puzzle herself. So in this, she noticed she noticed what was missing, and what needed to be there. She also, so there was also, of course, her ability to give to the team, and her ability to figure out what was missing. And then when she couldn't find that, she knew someone who did. She knew someone else who had that ability, and she contacted that person, right? And then with that, and be able to relay that back to the kind of team, when I say team, or it could be client as it's stated here, it could be your team in regards to the IEP team. It could be a particular service that you're dealing with where you have a, sorry for the acronym, which is individual education plan. Sorry for that. Or you have the IPP, which is the through Alta Regional, right? But she knew that she was a considered an important piece of this team. And when I speak to parents, I always tell them, at the end of the day, when you're in a meeting and you're consulting or whatever it is in regards to your loved one, you are the captain of that ship. You are the most important puzzle of that piece. So that you need to remember that, right? Is that they are, and her showing this puzzle piece, realizing that, to me, and she was the valuable piece in this situation. And that's very important for us as mothers to realize that, is that because sometimes the tone and where it comes across and the prejudgment, you could feel less of that path, less of being that link in that puzzle piece. And I think for her, I think it was beautiful that she acknowledged that, I'm that puzzle piece. Can't do it without her.
That's right. And, she was not only a puzzle piece for her and her children, but also for others, right? So she recognized there were families that needed someone to help fill the gap right after this diagnosis, right? Right after they received a diagnosis, they needed some type of support, but specifically support from people that they could consider peers, people that could recognize and empathize on a level that they didn't have access to. So having parent peers was really key for these families, and she felt like she was a part of their puzzles also. So now we're going to talk about a project that came out of a similar community-based research project that took place at the mine. This specifically was investigating access to diagnosis of services within underrepresented communities. And in this project, we conducted focus groups. And as a part of this focus groups, we had a predominantly Black focus group. And in that focus group, we recognized that in our area, there was a huge need for a group specifically for Black families who had children with disabilities to support them through their process. And so we came up with this idea of Sankofa. And the word Sankofa comes from the African language, specifically Ghana, from Ghana, West Africa, Twi, that specifically means go back and fetch it. So this is significant to the mission and the purpose of the Sankofa group, and that all of the information and the resources that we share are about going and giving back to our community. So we were founded in 2015 in order to meet the unique needs for Black children who have developmental disabilities, and to support their families in being able to access resources, gain information in culturally competent manners. So we provide that type of atmosphere in Sankofa through our monthly group meetings. We met in person before the pandemic, and now we are virtual. And so we have supported over 150 families, and to be able over the past years, and have been supported by our Family Resource Center in the past, and now are supported by our IDDRC, in being able to help continue the legacy of this work.
So some of our goals and objectives, Dr. Morgan did state some of them, but to provide cultural relevant sensitivity training, we've had a multitude of people come and train in different areas that we find the families that are really kind of where they feel they want to focus on, to engage in different outreach events. I know myself and the other facilitators, Dr. Morgan is one of them. We have another one who is Dr. Burns. We really take the time in our leadership meetings to gather what we feel the families need or asking or requesting for. Some of it in regards to training, and some of it in regards to questions that they have with their loved ones' individual education plan. There is a wide range of different families that have come in. We've had older ones when they want to talk about transition and what that looks like. Our last meeting, I have to share, it was just absolutely powerful, because there all are, but we really got into the word transition, because transition, we think about school and it's a multitude of different things, but we have to think 2 years ago, we transitioned when the pandemic hit, right? That sent a lot of families in a lot of different directions in regards to their loved one with a disability. So we spoke about is going forward in 2022, what do we need to transition into this new year, that we're going to look to do self-care for ourselves to make sure that we can continue to provide for our loved ones. So those are the kind of things we kind of engage in. And we also talk about some of the painful things, that systemic things that are happening in regards to our loved one, along with their disability, along with the fact that, you know, if they're being treated differently because of their color of their skin. We also talked about discipline and kids being kicked out, not necessarily because of their disability, because of what they call willful defiance. There's all those different things. We truly engage with our families, and it's almost like it's like a sisterhood, a brotherhood coming together, and it's truly a safe place for the families to come to share. And the beautiful thing afterwards is, even though we only meet once a month, we still connect. Everybody has someone's telephone number, email. So if you're struggling in the midst of something, you kind of reach out to your fellow person that you know that you connected to. All the facilitators are available to do that too, but it's nice because it's just ongoing outside of the group.
Awesome. And so now we're going to give you some testimonies from some of the people within Sankofa. And so this particular testimony comes from a Sankofa mother, grandmother, actually, Tamara Larkin, who has been with us for, I think, a little over 2 years. And when she came to us and came to our group, she came just really discouraged because she felt like there was not a space for her to be able to come and express her frustration. She herself has been in the education system for many years, in school systems. But when it came to trying to support her grandson, she had so many doors closed, right? He was seen as a child that, you know, couldn't be fully included or educated, right? He didn't have a diagnosis yet, or the diagnoses that he had were actually ones that he wasn't getting proper, or wasn't getting supports to be able to stay within the classroom. And so she knew that there were additional services and supports that he needed, and especially diagnosis. And so in the process of being able to be a part of Sankofa and, you know, really being in community, tomorrow, it really inactivated some amazing advocacy and was able to get her grandson a diagnosis to be on the autism spectrum, but then also all of the services and supports that were a part of that process. So Benita's going to read the quote that Tamara gave us as her testimony.
Sankofa group, the Sankofa group to me is 3 words: support, safety, and resources for us. And it's interesting with this, before we move on, Tamara also brings this now to us each and every time. Just in our last meeting, she brings those resources that she continues to gain and learn or whatever about every single time she's coming to do this, she's coming to give back. And I think that's a beautiful thing about her.
Absolutely. And it's for us, right? It's for our community. We know that, it is really to be able to support communities that we know are not getting this information and are not getting the support. And then the second testimony comes from Valerie Crawford. And so Benita is going to read this one and tell you a little about Valerie.
My confidence level for creating an opportunity for my family is continually increasing by taking the initiative to access services and supports for positive lifestyle and change. I've become a strong advocate for my children. This is a personal good friend of mine, and she does have 2 twin boys. And I remember meeting her at a young stage in her children's life, and that, it was always, she felt that she was the struggles going on, that she said, but I can't seem to grasp what is it that I just can't get these services and what have you that I need for my children. So just through talking and, her developing her own, going back to school, learning about the different laws, and truly taking the stance of, saying, I got to figure this out. As some of the mother stated before, is, I got to find this out. I got to figure where my support is. I got to gain this knowledge. Right. And that way I could just stand, and to see her now, and we've all been there, I've been there. My son is just older, just to see where she is now and how she's continuing to give back to other mothers, giving back into where volunteering at her school to make sure that, because she has that capability, that she's advocating for those children also in her boys' classrooms. And so she, tomorrow, always comes and gives back information and shares and say, hey, this is going on. And it truly is, you see a full circle happening with these families that come. And I think she's been with us for probably about 4 years. So, and we learned from them too. We just learned from them. It's just a blessing to see where their families are that started several years ago, where they are coming today.
Absolutely. Benita, like Benita said, it is a community. Benita, myself, and Dr. Burns are just facilitators. And Benita and I are parents also, right? And first and foremost, of children on the autism spectrum. Dr. Burns is also a parent. And this idea that, we are in this together. There is no hierarchy. We are here to be able to support one another. And that truly does manifest itself in the group. And so now we're going to give a video from one of our members, Diane Milner, and she is a mother of her daughter who is now in her 30s, and she is blind and autistic, Black woman, and she's specifically discussing how Diane came to know about Sankofa.
So my daughter Ashley was born 4.5 months premature. She weighed 1 pound 5 ounces. The doctors told us to name her so she would have a name if we had to bury her, because they did not think she was going to survive. But there was one nurse there who said, she looks pretty lively there, and she did end up surviving. She's a great kid. However, I don't know anything about disabilities. I am reasonably well educated and consider myself somewhat sophisticated, but about disabilities, I was absolutely ignorant. So I did what I normally do when I don't know anything. I started reading books and researching, and then talking to people. So as I learned to network with people, I found out about various advocacy organizations. And that's really how I became involved and more familiar with disability issues. I got involved in a number of advocacy organizations. I became an officer. And along the way, what I've learned is the more you network, the more information you get from professionals who can be very helpful, but also from parents who can tell you tips and tricks and on the ground advice and information. So I learned about the Centers of Excellence from a nonprofit disability board I was on, and I just started researching the Centers of Excellence, and I learned about the Mind Institute, which is the closest one to where we live in Oakland, California. And as I researched, I just happened to find out about Sankofa, which was a group geared toward African American families who have members with disabilities. And I was delighted because we do have some unique issues in our communities, and to get that mutual support and information has been extremely helpful to me. And of course, the leaders and the moderators are fantastic. And I've already gotten some tips that I'm using to help advocate for my daughter.
So now the next video that we're going to show is another video specifically from Diane, talking about why she believes groups like Sankofa are necessary to support the advocacy development and the resource sharing for Black families.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the intersection between race and disability, and specifically African Americans. What I found that a lot of African Americans are eager to get information and support from each other, including myself, but a lot of times we're not privy to the sources of information. So we have to help each other provide that. So for instance, I've already participated in probably 3 or 4 other general parent support groups that include all races, and the information that I've learned has been phenomenal. But when I talk to many other parents of African Americans, a lot of times they don't know about these groups, they don't know about the information, and they are so grateful and eager to learn about it. So it's really I think, a lack of information and coordination, and we need to improve that. And that's why Sankofa is so important. One of the examples, I think, of the intersectionality of race and disability involves my daughter. So my daughter is 32 years old, and over the years, we didn't really know that some of the symptoms she exhibited could indicate that she has autism. So she was not diagnosed with autism until this year. So she was 32 years old. And I've read in the literature that a lot of African American children are diagnosed on the autism spectrum very late. So I don't know if it's deliberate, if it's just neglect. It's probably a combination of both, or ignorance. But because I did not know that, I didn't know what to look for. I wish I had talked to more people. I wish I had had a group when Ashley was a lot younger, so that I would become more familiar with what to look for. And I think it's important for us to spread the word to other African Americans that they need to be looking for these signs and asking questions, because a lot of times professionals, educators, probably not intentionally, but sometimes probably out of neglect, don't always diagnose our children on the same level that they diagnose other people. So again, Sankofa is extremely helpful to me. Spreading information in the Black community is so important, and I highly recommend it.
So the implications for this work transcend outside of the university setting and support the need for all of us to take a deeper look at the roots of the problems, because it is at the root that we will find both the barriers and the solutions. Black mothers are advocates and have been advocates for generations. The disparities that we see in diagnosis and access are red flags for the effects of systemic racism, sexism, and ableism, and are in our intersectionally oppressed groups. Thus, in order to create change, we must take a long, hard look in the mirror and think about how our institutions and personal attitudes have fostered and perpetuated these inequitable systems and allowed them to exist. We must take a look to change the current policy and practice on all levels so that accessing care is not a feat, but a right. therefore creating equity, inclusion for all families and all children. So we thank you so much for your attention, for your energy, and just and being in space and community with us. And we are leaving our contact information here. We'll also put it in the chat, and we will now open it up for questions.
Thank you. And I'm going to go back into the chat a little bit to ask some questions. The first one is from Lois Baldwin, and she asks, how do we manage the dichotomy between our children being less likely to be served and diagnosed and resistance within the families for their child receiving a diagnosis or label? Oh, it seems like you had answered that.
No problem. So I want to make sure I understood. So she was asking about why that might be happening.
Or how do you manage the dichotomy between the two? Children being less likely to be served and diagnosed and resistance within the family for their children receiving a diagnosis or label.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that definitely, so, you know, it's very challenging, right? I'm going to give you my personal example. So when my son was showing that there were developmental differences that were happening, and for him, and this is very common, but not always, children will have delayed speech, right? They will have a time where that they have a delayed speech. And so by one, he still didn't quite have words. And I remember talking to a neighbor who happened to be a white woman, and she had gone through our early intervention system for her child and was raving and saying how wonderful the experience was, and how, it's going to be she really was so happy that she had her child go through this, and he received speech services, and now he's, doing really well. And we had a relationship where I could be honest and frank with her. And I said, I know this all headwise. I'm an educator. I know child development. This is something I'm very familiar with. I know in our area in particular, our regional system in California, we have really good statistics for when kids go through early intervention and receive speech, for instance, during early intervention, many of them graduate out of services, right? So it's a great thing. I know this, but I told her, I said, as a Black mother, I have a Black son, and it's more than just a diagnosis or a label, right? So I already know that he is going to have all of these obstacles just because of the skin that he's in, that are going to be in his way and in his experience, right? And so knowing that, we might potentially have to, have this additional thing, right? It definitely was overwhelming. Of course, we went through the process. We got him the intervention and got him the services. But I will be honest, that definitely was a variable, right? So it's this idea that we need to be very intentional. And that's something that we've done some projects on. We actually have a video series called Sharing Our Journey that is available on the UC Davis Mind Institute website. But you can also Google it, Sharing Our Journey, UC Davis Mind Institute, and you're going to see a series in English and in Spanish where we have videotaped and made a series on how families can navigate or really understand and accept the diagnosis for their child. We have it in English and we have it in Spanish. For specifically, the English ones are targeting Black families and so having Black family voices and professionals. And then our Spanish ones are Latinx population, Spanish speaking population. And so, we try to address that, right? The stigma of disability, right? And how can we be able to overcome that in our community so that we can be able to support our children, accept our children, and truly love our children. But then also there's, the barrier of, the fact that, many of our children aren't getting the services, right? They're not getting the supports. When the mothers do express concern about their child to a physician or pediatrician or, someone in their school, many times they're told that they're overreacting, right? That it's not a thing. There's no there. And in some situations it's reassuring, right? And then others, it feels like their voice is being, silenced, right? And so this is a issue that we have, and the two do not support one another, right? Those two examples, they help to create the disparities that bottom line, don't support the development of the child, and support the access for the child, which will become, an adult that should be able to advocate for themselves. And so, this is, these are things that we need to address. And we're hoping that through, the projects and as well as the research that, we'll be able to have these discussions, so that we can be able to get to a place where we're doing better.
Thank you. Earlier, also in the chat, Nadine Chance asked, how do you set up a committee in schools for Black families and families of color for kids with autisms to deal with these issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely want Benita to chime in because Benita's connected to our CACs, which are Community Advisory Councils, through our SELPAs. And so she might have some input on that. But I would say the number one thing, so for instance, if you're a school leader or school administrator, I'll put that hat on, you want to make sure that you have some not only relationship, but cultural brokers, right? So people within your community that you have established trust with, and they trust you, and you also are sharing power, right? So if you have a desire to want to really allow people to exercise their voice and support one another, then you're going to have to make sure that they have the space, and you will, provide the forum for them to do that, but also give them the power, right, to be able to make decisions for themselves, and for their community. So that's a big part of that. And so that's, easier said than done, because there's usually the reason why we have these power dynamics and these scales are because they benefit, right? If we're in schools and, this hierarchy that we have helps kind of keep the ship afloat, right? And so we have to really think about, how are we going to change the way that we do things, and change the way that we see things and support one another if we really want to affect change. So I see Benita's on, so I'll let Benita share.
I think if I've heard the question correctly, I think it's also important, like in our district, because it was such a great challenge with engaging minority parents, Black parents. They trying to develop where they have kind of peer parent coaches. And also with our CAC, Community Advisory Committee in our district, we also have a African American kind of alliance committee in our district where we're trying to address to make sure to develop how we have that support for our families. So in our district, they also have what they call FACE, which is Family Engagement Center. So we've engaged in a lot to help to try to engage in a lot with them to develop support for parents. And one of the things that parents stated is that with having support for their loved ones with a disability, they wanted to come to them, meaning being to where it's convenient for them and not necessarily at a site that's convenient for the district. So there, it's nothing that's really, I feel that, it's all in a work in progress, to say that. But I think me as being on the Community Advisory Committee for our district, I'm constantly trying to bring awareness to the simple fact is that we need to meet parents where they're at and how and support and engage in their parent and into with them and their children, and also help them in the support of their team. And meaning team is that there are multitude of team, most of the people that are engaged in their team, whether they're speech pathologists, occupational therapists, teacher, it's all important. But it will take, I think to me, for myself, it take time to collaborate all that, but it truly is important to start with developing that with the teacher and the people around you. And I also think it's important to engage into the people that are in your classroom, in your loved one's classroom. I know that's a part of a lot of parents that have done in my district that have done that, is engage with the parents that are like-minded, per se, like them, that are in their child's classroom.
Thank you. Danielle Lowry states earlier, greetings. In urban communities, low-income families and families who receive government assistance are subject to the rules of private insurance and Medicare, which determines services available for families with autism/disabilities. In many instances, services exist. However, extensive waiting lists deter support for families. How do we address the concern with accessibility and availability?
That's such a great question, Danielle. And it's something that, when we talk about systemic issues, this is a part of the systemic issues, right? That really keep us who are trying to do equity work from being able to really enact it, right? So, this is where there has to be advocacy on all levels to be able to really think about, why do we have populations that are impacted by, generational poverty, generational, how the income gaps, and we have, lack of generational wealth, which therefore impacts access to insurance. Right. And so, there's reasons behind this. It's not because the individual has desire to not have a certain type of insurance, right? So because of that, we need to really address the fact how, our current, systems are set up in order to really, really uphold that certain people will have access and certain people will not. Right. So it's that allocation of resources that we see today happening. And we are dealing with this even, on our campuses, right? And so you have to think about, if we really want to make change, we have to make it on all levels, and we have to be vigilant about really pulling upon and accessing our policymakers and those who are making decisions within organizations and companies, so that we are making the change on every level so that we can include all families, and all families will be able to have access. There's this old adage that I love, is this idea that, where you might have one population has a cold, right? So you could say, it's hard for everyone. Number one, navigating these systems is hard for all families, regardless of race, socioeconomic status, all these things. It is challenging, right? So all families are going to experience a cold. But if you have the most oppressed populations, especially those that have intersectional oppression, double oppressions, triple oppressions, they're going to have pneumonia. Right. So there's a different experience here that's happening for families, depending on their positionality, their experience, that what they bring to the table. So we need to acknowledge, if we really want to be able to make systemic change, then we need to think about those who are being most impacted, support systems that support them. Therefore, we're supporting systems for all. Right? We really are across the board going to make our systems more equitable for everyone. So it is an issue, and it's something that we need to address.
Thank you. Not too sure where in the presentation this question is for, but Shauna Tarboro says, thank you. Where did she go to get diagnosed as an adult? What was the trigger to get help or get a diagnosis?
Yeah, I think that they were talking about Diane Milner. So our friend, our Sankofa member that was on the video. So I'm not sure where she got diagnosed. I do know she's connected to the mind. Most of the time, if you're an adult, it's private pay in those situations, and families have to go about and find, a psychologist or psychiatrist, a clinician specifically that has that expertise, a developmental pediatrician that sees adults might be someone too. So there's a variety of different spaces to be able to get diagnosis, although it's very challenging, right? Especially the older people are, to be able to receive this diagnosis. And we know that, autism in particular is an equal opportunity disability, in that, everyone and anyone can have it. But we do see that, for specific populations, that we have disparities, and we are just now getting diagnosis for many of our populations. Like Benita said in the statistics earlier, most children, when diagnosed, they're misdiagnosed, right? And they're given, more disability categories that have are connected with emotional disturbance and things of that sort, and don't have the same type of intervention that's necessary and supports that are necessary. And so, because of that, we have adults, right, that have been and have not either misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. This is what we have, right? And so we need to recognize that and hopefully, really look at how can we address that to support our adult populations.
Thank you. Haley Tenor asked, or states first, you talked a bit about code switching in the beginning. Would you say that is similar to the concept of masking, where autistic people hide their autistic traits to gain acceptance from a neurotypical society? How do Black autistic people balance both code switching and masking on top of having a disability?
That's a great question. And, it's one that I probably wouldn't be able to answer in all honesty. I think that, there are similar concepts. And I think that, if you are knowing that you do have to mask is a great example of you knowing how to code switch. That is an amazing example of that. But I think the experience of being a Black autistic person, that is going to be something, and that is actually a voice that we need to hear more of. Right. So we need more Black autistic researchers and providers and clinicians to be able to tell that story, right? Of, what is this experience of, being Black and autistic and possibly, being a woman or, not heteronormative, like all of these different things. We need that experience and we need that voice to be heard because we need to know about that.
Thank you. Let's see here. First off, there's a lot of good resources and comments in the chat, so people are free to go back and read the resources. Shauna asks, has anyone filed a race-based complaint to the Department of Health and Human Services? Have these parent groups brought in disability lawyers? Seems like a huge class action suit is possible.
Yes, Shauna, I think that sounds like an amazing concept. Not to my knowledge. I'm actually really interested in, doing more work specifically on the history of Black advocacy within autism, because that's something that we do not have a narrative for. So we do know that specifically, when it comes to IDEA and many of the, ADA, many of the federal rights that we have for persons with disabilities, those are civil rights, right? Those came out of the Civil Rights Act. Many of those are all connected. And so as a result, we would think, right, that there was an imprint, right, that we had many Black activists, that were part of that process, but those voices, and that narrative is not readily available. And so we need that, right? We need that evidence of the past, but we also need to document all of the advocacy that's happening now, right? So for future generations, and as well as, the type of effect and change that we're making now. So I think you're right. Those are major things that we need to acknowledge, but nothing that I know of currently. I don't know, Benita, are you familiar with anything?
I mean, not offhand, I know that there's quite a few that's going on in that area, but not directly through some of the boards that I'm on in regards to deal with attorneys that have attorneys for special education. There are multiple lawsuits in that setting, but I could not cite them for you.
Thank you. We have one last question inside the chat, and then we're going to pivot from there. LaShayland Foltz says, for someone with high functioning autism, what can they do if the service that was helping them says that they are fine and don't need any more services? From my understanding, it's not something that just goes away and has caused my friend a lot of stress in her school and personal life.
Mm. Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I think, because it's, so individualized. I think that, number one, all people, all autistic people need the proper services and supports, right? No matter what, level people have labeled them. And so I think that that's absolutely key. And to me, the best route is to always look at the individual strengths of the person, and think about what are the things that they need to be able to allow full access and inclusion. There are a lot of people out there that do work on that. But, as a parent, I always think that, I am the expert of my child, right? And so my job really is to, not be the therapist or to, be the interventionist. It really is to be the mother and to, support him and for him to be the best person he can be, and like you said, autism is not a conditional, thing. It's a way of thinking, right? It's a way a person is wired, and I love that and accept that about my son, and I want him to be very proud of his identity as being a Black autistic person. And so that's really important to me. But yeah, I think that I'm hoping I'm answering your question, but I think it definitely, it's going to vary, but I think one of the things that we try to do within our support group, which by the way, is open to everyone, and across, all of the different states, we have people that come from, Florida, from Virginia, different places. So, everyone's welcome to come and participate. And also we have people that do not have Black children or do not identify as Black, right? We have people that, they identify as a person of color, and they feel like this is the only space they can go to actually talk about culturally relevant topics when it comes to disability. So, all are welcome. But I think groups like that, right, are important so that we can talk about these things and be able to process it together.
Thank you. I have placed your contact information inside the chat. I'm going to hand this over to Natalie. Natalie, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to Dr. Morgan and Benita Shaw for their really wonderful presentation today. We saw a lot of active participation in the chat. And thank you to John for facilitating the chat. And contact info from my colleague Jeff for both Dr. Morgan and Ms. Shaw. And I am Natalie Luna Rose with the Arizona Center for Disability Law. And I'm going to put our information about our agency in the chat. You can go to our website. You can also go to our website to register for the other sessions that will be going on through the month of February. We have two on Thursday, February 3rd, one at 9 a.m. and one at 1 p.m. Arizona time, which is Mountain Standard Time for those who are not quite sure exactly what Arizona time means. So I want to thank our sponsors really quickly. Thank Perkins Coie, Arizona Department of Health Services, Valley Toyota, Ability 360, Unique's Multicultural Connections, Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council, Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, Arizona Commission for Deaf and Hard of Hearing, Arizona Community Foundation, Banner University Health Plans, Diversability Incorporated, Lexus Superstition Springs, National Disability Rights Network, Marks the Spot, NAACP Maricopa County Branch, Raising Special Kids, and to our co-host, ASGAR, Arizona Center for African American Resources, Sonora and USED at the University of Arizona, and Institute for Human Development at NAU, and finally to my colleagues here at the Arizona Center for Disability Law. And many thanks to our interpreters and our captioners today, Joshua, Crystal, and Tracy. Thank you so much. And for those who are asking about CLEs and certificates, we will, CLEs are for certain sessions. Session 3 will be one of them. So if you take a look at the registration link, you'll be able to see which sessions are. I believe the 3, 6, and 11. and certificates of attendance. If you fill out the survey, which I do believe is in the chat, the link for the survey, you can get that information there. If there's no other questions, I would bid you all a good afternoon, and we hope to see you again Thursday at 9 a.m. Arizona/Mountain Standard Time. Thank you.
Thank you.